Claudia's Brain, a Funeral. The Arab Spring skipped directly into winter. The democratic protests were met with violence by authoritarian leaders or counter-demonstrating militias. In some cases, civil war ensued. Where existing leaders were forced out of office, the result was a power vacuum. Military dictators or religious extremists rushed to fill those voids. It turns out, evil too abhors a vacuum. In Egypt, Morsi, the first democratically elected president, quickly annulled constitutional amendments limiting presidential power. When more protests broke out, al-Sisi led a military coup d'etat in Egypt. Claudia's hopes, and the hopes of all those protesters, for widespread democratic and rational reforms in the region were not realized. Not this time. In the U.S., the inclination to believe what is not true spread like a disease. The internet was supposed to democratize knowledge, but became a perfect petri dish for conspiracy, irrationality, and nonsense. The previous decade's deterioration of the institutions of reason by postmodernism meant we'd lost our innate immunity to the irrational. That ivory tower is now covered in soot, its stones crumbling, replaced with an open-air market where truth is just another commodity. Persig's Church of Reason is overrun by heretics. The reaction to the depravity was an equally irrational and overly certain moral panic instead of rational problem-solving, a seemingly lost art. Moral judgment replaced intellectual judgment as a core mission. It was astonishing to see the press and the academy abandon reason as a fundamental value in charge. The Fourth Estate that was once guided by public trust, facts, and reason had become increasingly tabloid and driven by corporate profit, or worse, driven by ideology on either side of the political spectrum. Reason was on the retreat. Those hell-bent on promoting our lesser angels ascended to power. The shining city on the hill went dark. Claudia would have resisted. In many poor areas of the country, an opiate epidemic infects astonishingly large numbers of mostly economically hopeless people. Opiates trigger the reward system in the brain. They tell the brain that the body is receiving something important to survival, such as nutrients or sex, vital to survival of the genes. And in response, the brain triggers strong cravings and compulsive behaviors meant to increase the acquisition and consumption of this vital substance. But it's a deception. The opiate substance these bodies crave has no nutritional value, no value of any kind. A second epidemic infects an even larger segment of the country. Millions of people are tuning into cable news channels, radio stations, or podcasts and are experiencing something similar to the opiate addicts. They sit in their lazy boys, sofas, or automobiles, consuming what is being infused. The information they are taking in also triggers an emotional response, a tap, tap, tap on their amygdalas. The result is a nonsense-based righteous indignation, moral outrage, or holier than thou towards a common enemy. Why do they feel such a strong need to share what they see and hear? Their emotions are jacked up as if they are taking in something important. Their antiquated brain structures are reacting as if their tribal leaders have informed them that their clan is under attack by outsiders bent on their destruction. But that, too, is a deception. The information they are consuming holds no rational or empirical truth, or is at least a major distortion constructed specifically to trigger those emotions. The enemy they attack is a mere straw man, a make-believe boogeyman. People are jacked up on an emotional response to a deception. It's low value, low quality. Those people are stuck, but so are the people who offer them nothing but moral judgment. There was that dude who actually showed up armed at a pizza parlor in D.C., jacked up on emotion and bad information, intent on freeing child slaves being held by the Secretary of State and the President of the United States, who were reported to be part of a child trafficking ring fronted by the pizza parlor. An idea that bore about as much correspondence with reality as the proposition that children in the U.S. were being abducted by evil unicorns. Yet it was reported, and some people couldn't sort through the nonsensical logic, the just so story. What are we to do? Should we not agree with Socrates and say with Homer, better to be a poor servant of a poor master and to endure anything rather than to think as they do and live in their manner? Somehow I'd missed out on the fact that the market for deception had blossomed into a massive industry in the U.S., and apparently there's now a sucker born or being shaped every second. Individuals who'd not learned to discern deception from fact. In fact, some media seemed designed to provide allies and validation for the ignorant. Ignorance became a shared badge of honor for a significant subculture. In other words, the country became a whole lot more redneck and a whole lot less hillbilly. Claudia would have resisted. Basing one's life and civic responsibilities on a deception, isn't that the very low-quality state Claudia was fighting against in foreign lands? Propaganda on one side, moral panic on the other, the secret extinguished. It felt like our country teetered, that, without the reason and truth Claudia and our founders treasured, we were sliding into a failed democracy. The paragon of animals. What a piece of work. How ignoble in the absence of reason. It feeds my mirth. How else but to go light with my disposition? How else to avoid the melancholy? George Will left the Republican Party. George Will. Wasn't that a canary in the coal mine? Didn't that suggest the party of Lincoln was being destroyed by a kind of toxic gas? And didn't that other party have its own toxic irrationality, an inability to distinguish moral, intellectual, social, and aesthetic judgments? What's happened to America? What's happened to the reason her founders so cherished? It's like someone decided that since reason is fallible or too much work, we might as well all tune in to ancient aliens, ice road truckers, and obnoxious plastic people engaged in contrived conflicts. Marriage and sex are great, but if my choices in either case are narrowed to any bachelorette, Real Housewife, or Kardashian, I'm getting myself to a monastery. Or maybe it's more cynical than that. Maybe there's something in the marketplace that benefits from a population who's lost skills for rational criticism. But how robust is such a marketplace? All this had me floating. I could already feel my feet lifting off, all made worse by the fact that my gravity, my anchor, was gone forever. I so wanted to talk to Claudia about all this. I needed her reason. I needed that gravity. And suddenly, nothing. She was buried next to her father. On that day, a single stationary cirrus cloud blemished an otherwise flawless sky, a sky that felt closer to Earth than normal. A wet summer in East Tennessee meant the surrounding sugar maple, white oak, and beech nuts were showing off their most brilliant autumn colors. That was the least Fortuna could do. The crowd that gathered on the hill was almost all from out of town. Benjamin's parents and siblings were there. Peter Thompson traveled back to Cumberland Gap for the funeral. Several former colleagues from the CIA and state attended, including the Secretary of State. Annie Jeter, who wrote the Time cover piece, was there and wept harder than anyone. Sylvia Price was there also. So was Piper. She'd always been such a good friend. I noticed Angus mulling around the perimeter of the group as the service started. All those strangers and the dignitaries intimidated Angus, or maybe he didn't trust himself to keep his emotions in check. I hoped to speak with him after, but when the service was over, he was nowhere to be found. Thompson said a few prepared words. I was taken with Claudia Verstand from the first minute I met her. She was a striking woman, that distinctive copper hair, those searching green eyes. But Claudia was first and foremost a philosopher, a lover of wisdom. She was a tenacious thinker. What are the facts? What is the truth? Claudia would ask. Everything else came after that, no matter how inconvenient or upsetting that truth might be. Not only, in my experience, was she usually the smartest person in the room, she was always the most prepared. More importantly, you never had to second guess her motives. If they weren't abundantly clear, and they usually were, all you had to do was ask. She served her country at the Central Intelligence Agency and the State Department with a sui generis distinction. She brought unique insights to her work at both places. She was a person of uncommon reason, dignity, and equipoise. She was a gadfly when we needed a gadfly. But Claudia wasn't just about a gifted brain. She loved as deeply as she thought. She loved her country, she loved her friends, and she loved her family most of all. The world is a better place because Claudia Verstand lived. She will be missed. That was where Peter Thompson apparently intended to stop, but he lingered at the front of the gathering and faltered for a moment, continuing without really meaning to. His voice changed as emotion gripped it. He looked lost. Here's the thing. Claudia saw the light and dark sides to the human animal. She saw the love, generosity, rationality, and creativity brought about by our better angels. But she also saw petty and tribal hate. She saw actual genocide. She saw that shit up close and personal. Her unique genius was to not be overly deceived by the light or defeated by the dark. She lived in the in-between. She dwelled on the spectrum of dawn and dusk. I, for one, will miss the hell out of her. Peter stepped aside. He never did overcome that swearing. Good. Sometimes the world needs a good cursing. After the service, I was approached by an older woman I'd never met. Did she live a happy life? The woman asked. I'm sorry? Claudia. I didn't really understand everything that was said. Do you think she lived a happy life? I think so. Happier than most, I would say. That's good. I stared at the woman in uncomfortable silence. There was something familiar. May I ask, who are you? I was her mother. I was stunned. I could see the physical resemblance. At about that time, Stella Robbins walked up with Uwe and young Robert. They stood there awkwardly as I tried to figure out what to say. Uwe and Robert, I guess this is your other grandmother. After a few minutes of small talk, Barbara Cooper Verstand excused herself. My father was there, but was a shell of his former self. The violent death of his protege and adopted daughter as a result of the service he so strongly encouraged apparently formed the final callus over the professor's damaged heart. He spent his final years isolated on St. Helena Island with his telescope and kites, discouraging visits from me and from Claudia's children. Penelope had died months earlier, a second love lost to the emperor of all maladies. Celia had stuck around. She asked to speak to me alone. You know she was always in love with you. I dismissed the comment. No, David, I'm serious. It was you all along. When Benjamin, never Benji. Benjamin asked Claudia to marry him a year before she asked him. She said no. That's not true. Why? It is, I promise. It was right before she left for Rwanda. She told him she wasn't ready. She talked to me about it. She didn't think she'd ever feel the same way about Benjamin that she felt about you. She called me before she went to see you in New York, after Rwanda, after witnessing the genocide. She intended to tell you, to find out if you felt the same way. Celia. It's the truth, David. She wouldn't tell me what happened in New York, only that you guys ended up not talking about it, that there was no point. It's not true. Ask your father. I think she talked to him about it. Why? I just thought you should know. You weren't her second choice. I asked my father. Claudia hadn't spoken to him, but she'd spoken to Penelope, who spoke to him. Penelope told the professor exactly what Celia told me. It didn't seem possible to me that Claudia didn't know how I felt all those years ago. Everyone else knew. Piper knew. Apparently Claudia didn't. When I had the chance to tell her, I hadn't. I offered lies and irony. The secret doesn't care. But here's the thing. Everything doesn't happen for a reason. No doubt good would have come out of me being receptive that long ago day in New York. Yet, a different good came out of the way things turned out. I had a few obligations to fulfill before I left Cumberland Gap for the last time. Claudia left the key to her father's house with her will. Her wish was that her children would spend one night in the house. It wasn't really for the children. It was meant as a symbolic gesture for Ernst Verstand. Claudia didn't believe that Ernst would ever know about this gesture. That wasn't the point. She hadn't been the least bit spiritual in that sense, but knowing that the gesture towards her father would someday be carried out infused meaning into Claudia while she lived. It was her honey. She hoped in some way the gesture might also have meaning for her children, if not on that night, at least at some point in the future. The next day I took the kids to the iron furnace. They were unimpressed. It's just a stack of rocks, Huey said. She had overwhelmed me with facts and history on my first viewing. I wasn't so well prepared. It's just a pile of rocks now, but it used to be a lot more. Back in the day, Huey and Robert waited for more information, but it wasn't forthcoming. Okay, it's just a pile of rocks. Next, we hiked to the tri-state marker. I thought of the many times I'd hiked this trail with her, singing Beatles songs and dreaming about our future lives. I hummed the tune to Two of Us and wished there was someone to fill in the lyrics, as she had always done. Peep, peep. There's a painted bunting. I pointed to a limb just ahead of us. It's pretty, Huey managed. Robert was clearly miserable. I know that hiking is maybe the last thing you feel like doing right now. I just asked you to remember that this was a request from your mother. She wanted you to come here one last time. This place had been important to her. It's okay, David. We understand. Don't we, Robert? Is it much farther? I think Robert is getting tired, Huey said. Not much farther. At the marker, Huey and Robert were less impressed with having your pinky in 3 states at one time than I'd been on my first hike up to the marker. That's kind of hokey, David, Huey said. Yeah, I guess it is. We headed back down with me feeling like I was somehow failing her. A few minutes later, I noticed a honeysuckle bush. Have you ever had honeysuckle? What's honeysuckle? Robert asked. Watch carefully. Hold the flower at the bottom like this. This is called the pistil. You pull it very slowly. You see that little drop? That's the honey. You lick it like this. Huey at least pretended to care. The tour ended in front of the gray shingled house. I stared at the now decrepit structure, standing with cockeyed effort at the other end of the buckled sidewalk. There was a broken window on the second floor. Many autumn's dead leaves overflowed the gutters. The demise of the local coal industry had not been kind to the area. It was on that very sidewalk that I first met your mother, I said. How old was she? Robert asked. She was 9. I was 10. You already knew my mother for a year when you were my age. That's right, Robert. Excellent logic. I stepped in the direction of the house. How could I have known on that first day? The children followed me up the sidewalk. She brought laughter and spirit to this house. She brought laughter and spirit back to my broken father. She had influenced the full arc of my life, had been and would be the only woman I would ever love. Does somebody live here now? It looks abandoned, Huey said. Don't know. Maybe a lady lawyer lives here. Who? Never mind. What was my mama like when she was 9? Huey asked. I stopped just short of the stairs. Wasn't this the exact spot I was standing the first time I saw her? I didn't like her at first. Why not? I thought she was odd. Odd how? I laughed. Oddly better as it turned out, I said, turning to face the house. They say some people are too good for this world, Huey. They tend to say that about good and great people who come to an early, violent death, the way your mother did. Louie reached for Robert's hand. Whereas Louie turned inward when her father died, she became the protector when her mother died. She turned to caring for her little brother, a tangible personification of her own grief, I suppose. She nurtured and looked out for him at every turn, showing little outward signs of the anguish that everyone knew she must have felt, stoic beyond her years whenever the topic of her mother came up. But there was one consequence of Claudia's death that would manifest outwardly in Louie. The black beret, black vest, and white gloves of Uiwani Marcel would never be seen again. I've read books on most of those other good and great men and women. Truth is, they were all flawed. But your mama really is too good for this world. People don't like that. A sob from Robert brought me back to the present. Shame washed over me. She would not have been pleased by that pointless little rant. I reached down and pulled Robert to me, then took both children by the hand. Let's get our stuff. I think it's time to go home. Then the most random thought popped into my head. How did Ernst Bernstein stay so well stocked in fresh honey?